All right, welcome back to the architecture track. Hope you've been enjoying this conference so far. And up next, we have Stephen Van Beelen talking with us about RSocket event sourcing. So the floor is yours, Stephen.
Awesome, thanks. Well, hi everybody. I'm Stephen, as I've just been announced. I'm the lead developer for Axon framework at AxonIQ, and I'll be talking about event sourcing with RSocket. So, event sourcing with RSocket, what I'm trying to explain here is making an application using event sourcing and some other concepts, and how that combines, I think, very well with the idea RSocket brings to the world. So, as my time is somewhat limited, I need to jump over into making a bunch of assumptions. Because I'm expecting some knowns from the audience, we'll be glancing over them rather quickly because, as stated, I don't have that much time. First of these, what we're aiming for at AxonIQ with Axon Framework and other products we have is that we provide a suite to do D2D, for example. So D2D, domain-driven design. What I anticipate with D2D basically is that you're deriving domain models which solve selected aspects of the problem domain you're in. So really a domain model describing what your application aims to do. Secondly, I'm introducing command query responsibility separation, or CQRS for short. Roughly, this states that you're separating the command and query concerns of your application, which you could see like just switching the APIs, having a distinct API for commands and queries. I'm, however, going to combine this with DDD, so I'm having distinct models. A separate model, a command model for the command side of things, and query models for the query side of things, where the command models are in charge of doing your business validation. They make the decisions whether a command can be performed, and your query models are there to provide the answers as efficiently as possible, as you require. Thirdly, I'm going to set event sourcing on here as well. What event sourcing means in the combination of DDD and CQRS is that all your models are sourced based on the events. In this architecture idea, you would have your command model making your decisions, which are factualized by publishing events and storing those events. These events are then used to rehydrate your query models, but also to rehydrate your command models. This is what I see as event sourcing in this case. And lastly, I've got a rather basic one, which I assume the majority of you knows, microservices. I think the combination of these three paradigms allows us to make separate, clean services, which definitely need to talk with one another, but we have a nice onset to do this with. And it's this talking with one another, which is going to bring me why I think this works very well with RSocket. So let's look at that a little bit further. I'm going to define a couple of message types. I assume the majority is also aware of events as a distinct type of message. Event-driven architecture is relatively hip nowadays. So what an event is basically a notification that something relevant has happened inside your domain. So past tense, very deliberately. Something relevant has occurred, and some components in your application react to this. Events are broadcast to whomever is interested in them, and there's no real way to respond to some service not being happy with that event. You cannot do this because an event can be from the past. In real life, you cannot react to something from 5 years ago either. You cannot tell that thing from 5 years ago that, hey, this event isn't nice. You can't. It simply happened. You need to deal with that fact. Now, microservice communication just with events. You can do this, but I'm recommending not to just use events. You would be modeling everything in past tense. It's broadcast to everybody. You cannot directly react to this. It's not ideal. So I'm going to introduce two other messages, which are going to be very beneficial in this idea of microservices communication, which are the commands and queries. Really looking back essentially at doing CQRS with distinct models and distinct APIs, which are going to be our messages. The command is routed to a single source, expresses the intent to trigger an action inside the domain. So it wants to do something. It doesn't state it has happened. As it wants to do something, it needs to be targeted to the service or model in charge of making that decision. This is why it's routed to a single source, and you want this to consistently happen. Also, in some scenarios, you want to be certain that that command was handled successfully or not successfully. So there is a type of response going back. You don't get the entire result of what you have changed. You just get a okay or a not okay. To actually get a full-fledged result of information, this is what you would be using queries for. So the request for information or state would be derived through a query. These would be routed on a different fashion again, because there are different ideas of doing query messages. You either request something from a single source, you request to group something and gather those results, or you want to be kept up to date to any additional changes to this model. We see a notion of load balancing in here as well, based on the performance. And well, definitely there is a result from dispatching a query. Otherwise, you don't get anything. You're not really dealing with this. It's this idea of doing secrets, DDD, and event sourcing with this messaging style, which allows me to draft up a paradigm or a diagram like this. So up top, we have our controller. We have some command handling and query handling components. And in this case, we can use our commands, events, and queries to make everything flow very nicely. We're just dispatching a command. We expect a result eventually. Do the same with queries. Those events can be disjunct in time as well. We're very, well, reactive almost, asynchronous. We're reacting as it occurs, as we need it to. We have a distinct model down below for the commands and for the queries. Nice separation, a nice onset to go for microservices. There is one unknown in this case, though, and that's the controller up top. This controller is essentially our boundary into what the other world thinks or what the other world wants to speak to. You can be ideal in your API and do this with commands, queries, and events, but there is an outside world you need to deal with as well. So this might just be a REST controller. I think we all know what REST does for us. Well, it's definitely here to stay, but I don't think this is the most ideal solution to do everything, because REST is more, a paradigm expecting you to be synchronous. It pokes your system wanting to get your information immediately, or doing a post and getting the update to that post immediately. This is not really working well with the idea of that you can extract everything from one another and make those microservices lay further away from one another. You need to have a nice idea of messaging where the extension, that elasticity is in place. So you can do this with REST, but I think this is a dead end. It's not the nicest way to do this. You can still spoof the idea, but I think there's a better way to do this. And that's essentially where I want to fit in RSocket, because I think RSocket does allow us to do this in a nicer fashion, dealing with commands and events and queries, simply because it's based on this idea of messaging as well, and doing that reactive approach to it all. So whereas we first were on a road to death, I would almost say, now we're back to sunshine and rainbows in Happy Land, because I do think that RSocket as a controller to applications like this is a smart move to make. Now, prior to diving into that, a short 101. It's definitely not a getting started on RSocket. That was a talk from last year from a good friend of mine, Ben Wilcock. Definitely take a look. It's definitely good. In short, RSocket is reactive, message-driven, bidirectional, multiplex single connections, polyglot, open source. Awesome stuff. Definitely. Most important bit for what I'm trying to portray here is the idea of doing commands, events, and queries through the interaction models it provides. It has several interaction models where we have fire and forget. You fire an operation, and you don't really care about the response. You don't need the response, so you just fire it and you go away. Request response, being that you send a request and you get a response back once it's there. Then we have request stream, requesting information and getting a stream of whatever you want back in. And you can do a channel, which is a bidirectional. So you can, from the client to the server, you can several responses and vice versa as well. So it's this idea of this interaction models, which we can map to the idea of doing commands and queries. And that's what I'm going to do. To that end, I have prepared a small demo application, which I'll be showing in a couple. It's a rental application where you can rent, return, and register games at, and find them if you will. So firstly, let's have a look at the command API of this application. It's very basic, which is fair, I think, for a demo like this. This application allows me to rent a game, return a game, and register a video game. Now, if we take a look at what these interaction models do, we can think about what the command does from a messaging perspective. It's routed to a single source, and we might get an okay or not okay. This already signals that things like request stream and channel don't directly map to this. Maybe you could make it work, but it's not the ideal mapping of these interaction models. I do think, however, that fire and forget and request response fit the bill very nicely. Which of the game rental application commands fits nicely depends on what this API really requires. Now, in this case, rent or return can be fire and forget. We just rent a game, return a game. We don't really care about whether the command executed successfully. We'll see that eventually. And if it didn't, then we just dispatch the command again. That's the intent, at least. Registration is different, though, because you're registering a new video game. And if you want to do follow-up operations on that video game, you need to have the identifier. When you're dispatching commands, one of the results next to OK or not OK, which is valid, is identifier of constructed entities, like a game. So the register would be a request response approach. Okay, time to move over to the queries. Again, rather straightforward. We have two approaches. We have a find game and a full catalog. The find is just retrieving a single game you're interested in based on an identifier, where the full catalog is stating to the system, give me all the titles you have for rent and, well, keep me up to date as soon as you get new ones. From the idea of queries, we can already immediately rule out fire and forget because we need a response. And fire and forget doesn't give us a response, so we cannot use fire and forget style for queries. Channel would work if you would be kept up to date with the new interesting information you want to require. However, in this case, we don't need that for this application. We can come by with request response and request stream, where the find is a request response style and the full catalog is the request stream solution. Okay, I think it's time to actually look at the stack I've constructed. Of course, I'm using Axon Framework, the solution to bring us the building blocks to do D2D event sourcing and CQRS, honestly, out of the box, making your life a lot easier, and also integrated that entire messaging idea of now being sharing with commands, events, and queries. I'm using Spring Boot as well, just to simplify my startup. Obviously, RSocket is into the mix. I'm adding an extension from our end, the Reactor extension, to use Mono and Fluxes from the APIs Axon provides. And I'm using Axonic Cloud as my messaging platform and event store. These commands, events, and queries need to be routed somehow. The messaging platform, Axonic Cloud, is going to do this for me. And as I'm doing event sourcing, I need to have an event store. So I've set that up already at the background. If you want to take a look, go to console.cloud.axonic.io, and you can attach your own application if you want. I do have another recommendation if you're starting an Axon app. This is rather new to us, hence why I'm explaining it. We're going to initialize it. Not too different from started.spring.io. We currently have start.axonic.io. Very, honestly, very straightforward, I'd say. You see the same things you would have from start.spring.io, however, more in an Axon flavor. So here you see I've prepared my game rental application, Java, Java 11, and I've set up all my dependencies, reactive, RSocket, data JPA. Right now, it's really a flavor, right? We are planning to enhance this component furthermore with a bias through the packaging structure, maybe something with the API, or how you're going to connect with Axon Cloud, or maybe Axon Server. All future music to come at a later stage. I think, however, it's time to, without further ado, move to my application, which I have prepared. So I've moved over to my IDE. I already have my game rental app. It's already at a decent stage. I already have a command side, a query side. I've created the core API in here. I have the queries, the commands, the events. It's already in place. I'm going to focus on constructing a new controller because I want to introduce RSocket into the mix. Yes, I have a REST controller in here, really just for, being kind to the rest of the world, because some people do want to use REST. Sure, that's where you can do it at. But right now, I want to introduce something else, which is the game rental controller with RSocket. I'm going to make this an actual game controller by adding the annotations like so. You can see I'm using profiles because that allows me to fine-grain select the components I want. I'm going to add to Axon components, the Reactor command gateway and the Reactor query gateway. All right. So these two provide me a gateway into the command and query bus, which are on Axon Cloud. So these provide me an entry point from RSocket into the idea of doing a command or dispatching a query. So basic, very straightforward. This allows me to implement register, rent, return, find, and catalog. So let's just do that. I've again got some live template up my sleeve. I'm going to do a register where I'm using a mono as a return, where the string is the identifier. I'm getting a game DTO containing details like the title, the description, and the release date. And all I have to do here is add the message mapping annotation really with the name register. And now I've essentially constructed an endpoint which I can react to from RSocket with the route register. Pretty straightforward. I obviously need to do something here still. I'm going to do command gateway.send because I'm just going to send a command. You see I've prepared this registry game command construction as well because you don't want to see me using getters and setters, do you? Pretty straightforward. That's all there is to it from this end, from the controller into the rest of the system. So I can do a similar thing. This is really the request response style we have because we get the request for registering a game DTO and we respond with the string of the identifier. When to return, we're going to be fire and forget. So we're going to use a mono of void. We don't care about the response. We don't need the response. So we just throw it away essentially. As it's so straightforward, I figured it's not very interesting for you guys to see me add two methods with mono void, and that's it. So I've prepared it like so. Just two distinct message mappings for rent and return using the command gateway again, which already returns me the mono, and I'm done. This allows me to move over to the following, the query end of it all. So define game is also a request response style. So I'm returning a mono, in this case of a game, which is the query response I'm returning for whomever is interested in it. Here I'm going to use the query gateway. This component allows me a bunch of operations, as you can see. I can do a lot of types of query. There's a subscription query in there. You also see scatter gather at the bottom. These are the ideas of doing a direct query, which is query. Scatter gather is scattering your query and gathering your results. A subscription query is to keep yourself up to date. As this is just returning a response, I'm going to do it with query. I'm going to do new find game, entering the game identifier, which is my query message, and I'm expecting the response type to be of game class. And that's it. Then we can move on to the last one, which I'm also going to just fill in there. Here you see I'm going to do watch game catalog. I am doing a subscription query because I want to be kept up to date. I'm expecting many of string. That's the result type I'm expecting, which already returns me a flux, which you can push back immediately, which we can rely on. All right, so this is the basics. I think I have something to start. So let's just do that. I have a profile all, which will run everything. So let's start it up. Let's see if the demo gods are nice enough to me today. And always takes a little longer, right? So I saw it starting. That's good. So we can issue some operations to this new controller I've constructed. For that, I'm going to move over to a terminal. What I'm going to use is RSC. So it's essentially curl for RSocket. And I've already prepared some of these. So I'm going to do the registration. I'm going to add debug so that we can see some information. I'm doing a request response style, and the route is to register. Then we see the JSON of that I'm registering the game Hades. Definitely a good one. If you haven't tried it out, go for it. And I'm doing this through TCP localhost 7000. If I run this, I see the metadata flowing through. I see the payload flowing through, and also get a response back of 8668, because that is the identifier of the game which has been registered. I can also see this in my application. I go back. Here I see the game command has been dispatched, and the game registry event has been, published as well. All good. Let's try out the other two. So I got a rent here as well. This is a little different. I'm doing FNF, fire and forget. I don't need a response. The data is a bit shorter. Apparently, Ben Wilcock is going to rent this game. Good choice, Ben. You're going to like it. And I'm going to dispatch this. You see, I don't get a response back. You can still see that this has been working if I go back to my application, because I see the rent game command being dispatched, a game rented event, because I've already set up a logging interceptor at the back. All right. Similarly, I can do this for return. So let's see. This does the same. Let's jump over and do the find as well. If we're going to do a find, you see I'm again doing request. Pretty straightforward. Not that exciting, right? But giving me a nice idea that this all is working. I've requested game 8668, giving me Hades with the release date set and the description. Also, that stuff can be seen through the endpoint. I see that the game returned event was dispatched after the return game command was handled. And similarly, I see the find game query and the game as a return value successfully. All right, let's do the last one. Let's do the watch. So I'm going to do the catalog. Here we see I'm doing a stream because I'm doing a request stream, and I just have a single game right now. So let's actually introduce another one, which would be fair that we actually see an additional one being entered. So I'm going to register another game, Horizon Forbidden West. I'm not out yet there, but still it's going to be published as a result if I register this. Well, you saw at the click of a button, it already jumped up on the left as well. I have Horizon Zero West or Forbidden West also as one of the titles in my backlog. And that's really the code bit I had to show. This gives me a little bit of slack time, which I was already hoping for, to show a bit of the rest of the application, because this controller is just very basic. And it makes it so that this idea of messaging can maintain within this application sphere. I'm very happy with this. I should have tried it sooner, honestly. What I have more in here is a command package, a query package, and a core API package, essentially modeling the idea of having messages and a command and a query side of my application. Just package segregation, so I can separate them out further if the need so arises. Core API, straightforward. We have a register game command. We see the fields really. It's just really a POJO. All these things are just POJOs. They're reflecting the message with its contents. In this case, I'm using JSON, hence why I'm having the constructor properties annotation. Similarly with the game, this would be a response type. All straightforward. On the game end of it all, this is an aggregate. So from Axon's perspective, the command model in this case is the game aggregate making the decisions if operations can be performed. So we have an identifier in here, some command handlers. So this is how the framework makes it work. You annotate a method with command handler. You are able to register game command in this case, or handle the rent game command in this case, where we see some business validation, because in this case we are doing some validation. And if it fails, then we throw an exception, and otherwise we apply an event, which we have seen all successfully up till now. As we're also doing event sourcing, we also see this back in our aggregate in the game, as we have event sourcing handlers, because it needs to be reconstructed for every command, sourced based on its own events every time to be as up to date as possible. These events aren't only used for the game side, but also on the query end. We have a view, as you can see. This essentially is the model. It's just an entity with a JPA repository attached to it. Very straightforward. And we have the game catalog projector, which projects the events into the game view we have. So repositories here. We have the means to emit updates. Here we have some event handlers, so not event sourcing handlers, but regular event handlers, which update the game view. Also make changes like decrementing the stock so that you can't rent out a game more often than you'd like. This is also where the query handlers are at, mainly because this component is in charge of updating the game view. So it knows best how to answer those queries. So it has to find game query handler, just another annotation with a response going back out, retrieving it from the repository and mapping it to something we do want to share with the outside world, being protective of our API. And we have the full game catalog query. All right. I'm honestly done a little bit on time, I think. I can move back to my presentation. And, I hope all of you enjoyed this. If you want to take a look at this application, this Game Rent 1, all these other pieces of code I've very quickly glanced over are all set in separate steps you can move over, separate branches. You can check them out, just see how it works. Go to my personal GitHub page and you can get a feel for that. Also, if you're interested in Axon Framework, a good starting point would be the repository. So github.com, Axon Framework /Axon Framework. If you want to have a bit more additional information from us, like how we do trainings or what other things we have, or getting this slide deck, you should go to our landing page we've constructed for SpringOne. I do hope you enjoyed my session, and if there is still anything unclear or you have some questions, I hope to see you in the Q&A session. And enjoy the rest of SpringOne, obviously. Cheers.
All right, thanks, Stephen. That was a great, excellent discussion of event sourcing with RSocket. Be sure to join the Q&A session and keep the conversation going. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we're going to talk about API gateway patterns. So hope to see you then.